Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm a virtual avatar in Developers Shore. I hope you're all doing well and ready to learn. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to invite you to become a member of the Great Devs. As a member of the Developers Shore community, you'll have access to our job opportunities, activities, and future webinars. You can join us by responding to our invitation email or completing the form on our website. Also, a recording of this webinar will be on our LinkedIn page. Without further ado, let's dive into today's topic. Please give a warm welcome to our speaker.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'll just start with the presentation, I guess. Let me just quickly share my screen. And please let me know if there is anything wrong with the feed. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Fernando. I'm Fernando Doglio. I've been working as part of the IT industry for 18 years now. In that process, I've written over 8 books, mostly related about JavaScript, and the last one called Skills of a Successful Software Engineer, more about the actual IT industry in general. So if you're getting started, I highly recommend it. If you find this workshop interesting or just want to reach out, feel free to do it over Twitter. That's my handle, DeleteMatt123. Or if you want to know more about me, just Google me. I'm gonna show up in a lot of places. All right, so what are we gonna talk about today? One-way data bindings, essentially, and kind of how you can use it to mimic what other frameworks like React, Vue, Svelte are doing in the web development space. I'm not going to show you how to build your own React. That's way outside of the scope of this workshop. It's more like trying to do the opposite, trying to figure out, based on how it works, how you can implement it. Let's put it that way. So I'm quickly gonna give you a brief idea of what is a one-way data binding. Then we'll try to do that reverse engineering. I'll show you how I implemented my version, and then I'll quickly close it with a couple of thoughts about why doing this kind of exercise is interesting, actually, and I highly recommend it for any type of developer trying to learn and trying to improve themselves. So let's move on. Let's start with what is a one-way data binding, essentially. And you've seen it already if you've been doing development, web development for the last few years, because it's everywhere. Every framework is implementing it. But essentially, you bind your variables, your model logic to the front end through a one-way channel. Why a one-way channel? Because when you update your variables, when you change something with your code, the front end is updated through that channel, but it does happen the other way around. If you have, for instance, an input field in your form and you enter something there, there is no way for you with this kind of binding, there's no way for you to have your variable automatically being updated. There's a reason why React has the refs, for example. Yes, I think there are frameworks, other frameworks that give you two-way data bindings, but the one we're talking about is the simpler one, and it's just simply from going from your code into the front end. And it gives you, it kind of simplifies the way you interact with your front end. There's no connecting code between your logic and the HTML code being rendered. And that is one of the main reasons why it's so popular and why everyone is adding them into their solutions, essentially. The lack of that code gives you more freedom, because that's one less problem you have to worry about. That is one less thing that you need to think about when you're creating your application. You take that for granted, and simply code around it. That gives you like a higher level of abstraction that allows you to build more complex solutions using these type of tools, essentially. I think of the one-way data binding as a tool that you have at your disposal and that you're actually using for every application. Maybe you're not even thinking about it. That's how good of a tool it is, essentially. But it's also fun and interesting to look at it and see how we can reverse engineer. So let's look at that magic. Let's look at that, what is happening behind the curtain when we write React, when we use our React code. And this is the code that we're going to try to implement. This is a very simple, if you'll be using React for any kind of time, you'll understand it, because I'm not doing anything special here. I'm just creating a simple component that is rendered on the right. You have two state variables and 3 internal functions within the component. Then simply returning the whole HTML that renders a title, a couple of strings, and then adds the actual state variables into the code. So whenever you click on those UI buttons, they will happen. They will change. Let's see. Oh yeah, I think that they said at the beginning the recording will be available on their LinkedIn page. So again, going back to this. So this is kind of what we're going to try to understand, and try to reverse engineer. So let's look at kind of what we have right now. So what's happening? Again, we're rendering 2 values. We're rendering 2 state variables, the counter and counter2 variables. Those are the ones that we care about. And we're updating the variables using the setters that React gives us through the useState hook. And the HTML is updating by itself. The HTML is doing its own thing. We don't think about it. It just happens. And the caveat here, and that I think it's also kind of a teller, is that we're using a separate function to update the value. I know that there are other frameworks out there that allows you to update a reactive variable, and that has the same effect as using the setters provided by the useState hook on React, but React doesn't allow you to do that. If you change a state variable, nothing will happen. So you have to use the set variable function returned by the useState hook. So we'll use that information for the future. So, how is this happening? That is the question that we want to ask, that and what are we not seeing? Because I think that the key here is not in what we're seeing, but rather in what we're not seeing. But just as a disclaimer, what I'm going to show you here is just my naive interpretation of how this can be used, how this can be implemented. I've not gone through the React code. That would be cheating. I've never worked on React core code or anything. So this is just me trying to figure it out. So what are we not seeing? Clearly, the connecting code is being hidden. The what's happening between the moment you update your state variable and the moment that value shows up on screen, you don't know what's happening. There's no DOM API being used or anything. It's also forcing us, like I said before, it's also forcing us to use the setter function. And kind of we need to think about that and why that would be. And finally, there is a lot more that could be happening as part of the JX parsing code that I'm not going to be tackling. As you're going to be seeing in a minute, I'm going to ignore the JX part. I'm going to give you an alternative that is less elegant, let's put it that way, but that works as well. There might be, as part of the JX parsing code, more logic that we're not seeing here. Let me just quickly check the chat. All right, yeah, there'll be an answer. All right, so let's reverse engineer the solution. I'm going to show you quickly the final result. This is the exact same thing that you were seeing on the screenshot before. There are buttons that are updating two counters, and they work exactly sorry, they work exactly like they worked on the example with React. However, this is not React, and let me show you quickly the code for it. And then actually I want to show you here so you see side by side, sort of. Yes, here we go. So on the left, you see the actual React code from the screenshot I was showing you before. And on the right, the code I implemented. There is a function, let's call it a component, being defined here. We are defining two state variables, quote unquote state variables, using the use state hook that you see here. Only instead of just receiving the default value or the initial value, I'm also giving them a name here, and I'll show you why. You know, I have certain limitations since I'm doing this. You know, I'm not going all the way, but I'm trying to give you a partial or as close as possible implementation. I have here my internal functions, like you see here, but I'm using a second hook that is not part of React. And then I have my HTML. Very similar. I mean, sorry. It's the same HTML. It's simply being returned differently because here I don't have a JS parser or anything. So I'm returning a template string with my two state variables being interpolated in the middle. I'm also here, and this is going to be key as well, calling a tag function. I'm going to show you what a tag function is in a second, but essentially it's a special type of function that allows me to be called in JavaScript using this syntax without the parentheses, essentially with a template string. That's pretty much it. But again, we're like 95% close to writing React code without actually writing React. And you saw the results is exactly the same. So let's see, you know, how that is and how that works. Let's go here. All right. So a couple of caveats here, a couple of things. Oh, that actually I forgot to show you. Let me just go back to the code one more time because I am doing something else that I wasn't doing in React. If you see this section here, calling for decreasing the counter, I'm calling the set counter to function. But for increasing it, I'm not calling the setter function. I'm directly updating the variable, like, you know, like one would expect. If it's a reactive value, if it's a reactive variable, then it should allow you to change it, and that change should trigger the update on the representation on the UI essentially. So I'm giving you 3 ways in which you can update these variables through the internal functions, like you see here, which actually call the setter function, directly calling the setter function here, or directly updating the variable value, like you see here. So there are essentially 3 ways, and for these 3 ways to work, some conditions have to be met. So the first one is that our state variables, they need to be globally accessible. You know, and this is where the POC nature of this code starts to leak in. But the HTML that I was returning is just a string that gets later interpreted and passed into an actual HTML node and added into the DOM. When that happens, that's way outside of the scope of the function that I defined. So my variables and my functions, they're all going to be gone by that time. So if I want the on-click events to work, that those variables and those functions need to be accessible on the global scope. So that translates into state variables being accessible on the global scope, internal functions being accessible on the global scope as well. So the include function, the reset function, so on, they're going to be accessible, and so will the setter functions. And finally, we need to bind, which is something that we haven't seen so far. We need to bind the variable to the DOM and figure out how to update that automatically. So those are the conditions that have to happen. The last one is one we already knew, and it's kind of why, the whole point of this conversation. So first part of the debunking the magic, essentially, the use state hook. Obviously, I'm not using the use state hook from React. I just called it the same to keep the code look alike. But the use state hook has to create this state variable, make it globally accessible, and then create the setter function, because it's also going to return that, and make it globally accessible as well. So here is the full code for the use state hook. To make something globally accessible on the browser, you can simply add it to the window object, and then you can call it without referencing the window object, and it's going to happen. It's going to be accessible anyway. So that's the trick that we use for the setter function, which you see here being defined. It's not doing anything other than actually setting the value. I mean, that is completely, unneeded in this implementation. But again, to keep it consistent with the React example, I wanted to give you an implementation as well. Now, the other bit of magic here happening is the call to new bound variable function, which I'm going to show you in a minute. But that is where the actual state variable is being created. And there is also a reason why I'm using the window object here, not just to make it accessible globally, but also to make the whole binding and one-way data binding work. And I'll explain it in a second. So the use function, the use FN hook that I added on top of what we already had for React, is simply moving or copying this function, the internal function that we define inside the component into a global scope. Again, adding them to the window object on the browser. A normally defined function in JavaScript is essentially an object more than a function, and it has properties like the name. So I can, without knowing, how it's called, or how the user will define it, I can use the .name property and add them into the global scope using it. So that will give you consistency when you call it without referencing the window object. And this is the whole scope as well of the use FN hook. There's nothing more to it than simply to make it available on the global scope. And the more interesting part is binding and updating, and that is where all the magic happens, the actual magic, let's put it that way. So binding variables or keeping a variable value synced with the front end, we do it through the object.define property. So let me backtrack a bit and explain why I'm doing this. In JavaScript, a variable is nothing but a simple container. You can add things to it, but you can't really affect the way you read it or in the way you add things to it, essentially. But it's not the same thing for properties. We tend to think of properties as simply variables within an object, but in JavaScript, we can add more juice to, or let's put it, let's say we can overload our properties, the object properties, to have more power. That power comes in my case in the form of getters and setters. So the define property method of the from the object in JavaScript allows you to, or rather takes an object and it lets you define a property by name and then a set of characteristics for that property. Is it read only, things like that. So one of or two of those characteristics of the property are a setter and a getter. These are functions that are going to be called by the runtime whenever you try to add or assign a value to the property, or to read a value from the property, essentially, or in other words, when you try to use the property. Now, we can take that advantage, that to our advantage, and add the extra logic that we want. So whenever we set a property to, whenever we set a value to the property, it will update the UI somehow. And whenever we read the value from the property, it will, give us what we need. Now, this doesn't just happen inside these getters and setters. The logic is there, but there also needs to be something on the other side, something on the HTML to link it. If I have my variable and I have my setter there, whenever I assign a value, I can run logic, but that logic has to put the value somewhere. And there is, right now, I haven't shown you yet a way for you to, a target for that value, because we were interpolating our state variables inside the HTML, which is a string, but there is no way for us to know, how that translates into the UI and, what happens to that variable, which gets turned into a string. I mean, we lose the reference there. And that is where the template string and the tag functions come into place. The template string, you probably know about it. It's a way that JavaScript gives you to create multi-line strings very easily and interpolate variables within it, again, with a very simple syntax. It's a much easier way to do interpolation. But if you combine it with tag functions, those template strings gain a lot more power, essentially, because the tag function is a special type of function that will capture both the HTML and the variables in a separate way, and it will give you a chance to transform that HTML, that string, in our case is HTML, to be something else. And that is where we'll create that target for the sending the value of the bound variable. Quickly check the chat. Yes, all right. So I give you all the highlights. So let me show you the details of the define property method I showed you before, the new bound variable function. That is where the actual state variable is being created. We gave it a name and we gave it an initial value. The name is needed because we have to define a property of the window object. Why the window object? And I kind of went through this, didn't specify, but I said before, there's more than one reason why I'm using the window object here to make our state variables globally accessible. And that is one benefit, definitely. But the other is that the window object is actually an object. So I can define a property of that object and then use it as a variable. I'm not defining state variables. I'm defining state properties, but I can use them as state variables, essentially. That's kind of the trick here, because we can ignore the whole window reference. Now, I'm saving the value, the initial value, and I'm creating a unique ID. We'll use that unique ID later in the HTML. But the point is, you see here the setter and the getter. These are the functions, the special functions you can define for any property using this define property method. The set function will be called, again, when you assign a value to our property, to our state variable. So what we do is we keep the value being assigned, the right side of the operation, essentially. And then we call the get element by ID. Now we're starting to use the hello API. Now we're starting to try to link, the logic, the model to the actual representation. We're using the get element by ID and using that ID we created before. Remember, this happens in two different stages of the operation. When we define what we call the use state hook, this function gets called and the ID is created. These functions are just, the getter and the setter, they're just defined, they're not being called. Now, when we try to update our state variable, the set function is going to be called, and we're going to grab that element ID we created originally for this particular one. And if there is an element in the HTML with that ID, which there should be, we'll update its inner HTML. And that's it. That's the whole one-way trip that the data follows. Whenever we set it, we find the element with the correct ID and we place it there as well. That's it. Now for the get function, we're not going to return the actual value. We're going to return an object, and you'll see why in a minute. But essentially, we return a JavaScript object with two methods: the toString and the real name. The toString is a special kind of method. Maybe you've seen it from other languages or maybe from JavaScript as well. But the toString method gets called by the runtime whenever you try to concatenate an object, or with a string, or use it with a string somehow. Essentially, when you try to serialize your object into a string, this method gets called by you. So you don't have to call it yourself. You can, but you don't have to. And the real name method is actually going to return the element ID that we defined before. And that's the magic. That's pretty much everything you need to know to create the one-way data binding. Now we have to think about the other side. Now we have to think about the how to create that element with the correct ID, because again, the ID is being created here whenever we use the use state hook. And on the HTML I showed you, there is no element with that ID, and I'm not specifically setting it, which is the point. I mean, what we shouldn't have to. So that's where the HTML tag function comes into play, and the whole template string also, and how they interact with each other. So here's an example, a simplified example of how the stack functions work. Essentially, you use them as you see on the left, with the, without the parentheses, and, the variables interpolated inside the string. So essentially what we're doing here is we're creating a string that has an h2 tag, and inside it will have the value of the hello variable. The hello variable, let's say, has a hello world string. Let's put it that way. That translates, when executed, translates into what's on the right, which is the function being called with an array of strings and then a list of parameters that are our variables. This is done by JavaScript. We don't have to do it manually, which is also kind of adds to the magic, adds to the effect. The string gets split into portions based on the sections where you add the variables. So in our case, we have one variable being interpolated between the two h2 tags, and that means there's a split there, and we have the opening tag and then the closing tag as separate strings, and we have one single parameter. If we had more interpolations here, more variables, we will have more parameters being assigned to the HTML function. So we can take those parameters and write a function that turns them into the string at the bottom, essentially the opening and closing h2 tags, but also something else inside with a unique ID. And that is where, we'll use the unique ID we saw before. So because we actually have access to the ID through the variable that we receive. So in this case, I'm just creating a span with an ID, unique ID, and then you see the hello world because I'm adding the value of the hello variable into a string. And that is what I'm returning. And that's what we're going to use for the actual implementation of the HTML function, which you can see here. It's not huge, actually. So you see the strings. First parameter is a array. That's the list of HTML sections. And then the variables, which is the rest parameter, because we have a variable name of attributes that can come after the first one. So we can really control how many are there. So it's gonna, I'm just turning it into a list of parameters. So the variables, I'm just gonna go through those variables, and for each one, just ignore this one in particular, because it complicates things and we don't need that at the moment. So let's start here. For every one of these variables, I'm calling the real name parameter method, which I show you already. It returns the actual ID, the unique ID of this variable. So we save it here on the element ID variable, and then we take the position inside the position on the list of variables for this particular variable, and we grab the same one for inside the list of strings. That means we're taking the previous section of HTML, everything that came before that variable, and we're concatenating the span element again with the ID being the unique ID, and then the value. I'm also adding there the actual value of the variable, and that's it. That's where I'm returning. I'm actually mapping it, so I'm creating a new array of HTML, but inside this new array we have the span elements. As a side note, why a span element? Why not something else? The span, as you know, probably doesn't have a structural visual effect on the result. It has no form or anything unless you add any kind of styles to it. So if I had added a div or a paragraph or something, I would see a difference from what I'm trying to represent into versus what gets represented. The span doesn't change that, so it has no effect unless I want it to have. So essentially, to put it simply, what I'm doing with the HTML function is creating wrappers in all the places where I'm adding these state variables, and these wrappers are span elements with a unique ID that corresponds to their corresponding state variable ID. Now I'm just simply adding the last bit of HTML, the last elements. If there is nothing, there are no more concatenations at the end. Just adding the last one to have the full HTML here, and then simply showing and creating a new string from this array. That's it. There is no more magic than this, but the output of this HTML is a new HTML that has all everything that I need, all the wrappers that I need. And this is kind of an explanation again of what I'm doing, but essentially we just went through this. When we're rendering, we're replacing the spot where, or the content of the unique ID of the element with the unique ID with a new value. That element is the span wrapper we created. And when we're setting the state variables, we're calling the set method, which again takes care of grabbing that span element and setting its internal HTML, and that's it. And everything works because we're adding everything into the window object, and then thus everything is globally accessible. So up to this point, and I'm going to show you so you can see it. If oh no, it doesn't show up here because it's all dynamic. Yeah, my bad. It's probably showing, I did not practice this part, so I don't know if it's actually going to work. But yeah, as you can see here, this is what I wanted to show you. This is where I wanted to add my first type variable, the first one of those counters. And this is the unique ID I created for it. Again, when I showed you the code, this wasn't part of it. So it was added through this process I've been showing you so far. And the same happens to this one, to the second counter. I don't have anything else. I don't have to worry about this. And this is all added by, let's call it the framework I created and that I just showed you. But that is the whole magic. You know, that is the whole thing. That idea is keeping things together. So, you know, finally, why go through this? Why bother? Other than because it's fun, I find it super interesting and super fun to try to reverse engineer how these kind of behaviors work. I think it's a way to take your skills to the limit, to what you've never done before. Through this process, you are forced to think about how the tool you're trying, or the behavior you're trying to reverse engineer works. You're forced to think about a mechanics that you've been given, you know, been taken for granted up to this point. You know that React gives you reactive variables or reactive behavior. Great, you're using it. That's fantastic. But how does it work? You know, it just does. And I think it's important. It is not a requirement to use React. Definitely no. You can definitely just assume it works and use it. That's the whole point why they build React. But if you want to go the extra mile, if you want to like push the boundaries of what you know and what you can do, this is an interesting way of doing that. Maybe you figure out a way to create reactivity in a completely different way than the implementation of React. That's fine, but you actually did something that you've never done before. You could have been building React applications for the last 5 years and never thought about this. And this mental exercise took you, one step farther. And that's why, I think this is so important. It gives you a chance to solve problems that you've never encountered before. You could be, using a library for a lot of time and building solutions or solving problems with a library, but that are completely different to the kind of problems that you face when you're building the library. Inside the web development space, if you've been on it for a while, you'll see that everything is kind of tries to, it repeats itself. The kind of solutions you're building, the kind of problems you're trying to solve, you might find different ways to solve them, different tools, different libraries, but you're always trying to do the same thing, unless you're focusing on building your library, unless you're focusing on building your framework. So this kind of gives you a peek inside those workflows without having to spend, so much time and energy actually going through the process of building a production-ready framework or production-ready library. And other than learning, the actual tool you're trying to reverse engineer, you're also learning a lot about JavaScript. You're looking for ways of, maybe doing meta programming, maybe doing, using tools from the language that you've never used before because you never had the need for it. And that's also a way to grow and your expertise on a language and on a tool, and also grow as a developer. It gives you kind of a different outlook at how things work. So definitely highly recommended. Finally, if you like this idea, this process, I would recommend you check out my Medium profile, the URLs there, because I have other articles that gives you also a kind of idea of how demystifying different frameworks. I have one on creating your own JSX parser, your own router, like the one from Next. I also have one, well, I have several. So check them out, because even if you don't want to implement them, just going through it and reading how those things might work, it might be useful as well. So that's it. That was a quick one. I hope you enjoyed it. I don't know if there are any questions or anything that anyone from the organization would like to add here. Otherwise, remember that the recording will be available on the LinkedIn page of the community. I guess, yep. Thank you, everyone, for sticking to the end and watching. It was really fun and, again, super interesting.
Our webinar has come to an end. I'd like to extend a big thank you to everyone for participating, and a special thank you to the speaker for a captivating topic. It was a pleasure having you all here today. Have a great rest of your day.